Hi, I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, and this is The American Idea, where we discuss the ideas, people, and events that have made America what it is today. We believe that by understanding our history and our principles, we can better live up to the promise of the American founding and preserve our ongoing experiment in self-government. Welcome to The American Idea. Well, I want to welcome everybody to this episode of The American Idea. Today, we're rejoined by a great friend of Ashbrook, Ed Achorn. Those of you who know, we had a great conversation with Ed on his wonderful book, The Lincoln Miracles. The Lincoln Miracle, discussing Abraham Lincoln's rise to the presidency, the unlikely story of that rise. If you haven't purchased Ed's book on Abraham Lincoln and you thought you knew everything you know about Abraham Lincoln, I promise you don't know that story. And it is told with a journalist's eye for the details of the story and the flow of the story. And it's a wonderful recounting of that story by Ed. Not surprising, an award-winning journalist, a finalist for major awards in the world of writing. He is a terrific writer. Let me commend everything Ed has written for our listeners to go out and purchase, including The Lincoln Miracle. But today it's the summer, and we're going to be talking about America's Pastime, a wonderful book that Ed has also written. And I think it's got one of the best titles I may have ever heard. Ed, I want to get this right, and I want to get the subtitle right. This book is called The Summer of Beer and Whiskey: How Brewers, Barkeeps, Rowdies, Immigrants, and a Wild Pennant Fight Made Baseball America's Game. Ed, did I get that right?
You did. That's tremendous.
Okay. Ed Achorn, welcome again. Welcome back to The American Idea.
Thank you, Jeff. It's great to be here.
This book, it's such an interesting subject, but I have to tell you, when I think about baseball games, and maybe even baseball today, compared to football, compared to basketball, other typically American sports, it seems very staid in some respects. It's not in constant motion. There isn't constant violence, and there is in football, for example. There isn't constant scoring like there is in basketball. It seems slow paced. It seems staid. As I said, it seems a little conservative almost in that small c sense of the word. But your book, which is a terrific book, talks about the wild origins of America's pastime. What was the summer of beer and whiskey?
Well, you're right. The early baseball was considered just sort of this wild and fast-paced game. It's hard to believe, given the reputation it's gotten. So the summer of beer and whiskey is about basically a single season in early baseball, 1883, and it's about a group of immigrants and bartenders and liquor manufacturers who set up a rival league to the established National League. They call it the American Association. And they charged 25 cents admission instead of 50 cents for the National League. They permitted the sale of beer and in some cases whiskey at their ball games, something the National League did not do. They had Sunday games, something the National League did not do. And I think this is doing all that stuff. They generated enormous interest in baseball. Baseball was on the verge of dying out, many people thought. And by bringing this new life into the game, basically because of the immigrant experience, they regenerated the game and made this wonderful new league that people could go to.
So take us back. So 1883, maybe even before 1883. You said there's the National League that exists. Some of our listeners are going to be baseball historians, and they're going to have read, works by, say, for example, George Will, the political commentator, also writes on baseball, as you know. They might know some of this, but early baseball by 1883, what is its situation in America?
Well, it's based in the largest cities of America. Thanks to railroads, it became feasible for clubs to travel all around the country, the best clubs, and they formed into leagues and created professional baseball. And many of the same teams exist today. It's very interesting. Chicago Cubs, for instance, go all the way back to the beginning of the National League in 1876. The Boston team became the Braves, and it still exists in Atlanta. So these franchises go way back. And baseball was developing then. It had begun as this sort of gentlemanly game that men had formed clubs, and they went out and played baseball at their clubs, which is why it's still called ball clubs. And they played a sort of gentle game, thrown underhand. They would whack the ball and they would catch it barehanded. By 1883, this had become a very fast, brutal, ruthless game, played barehanded still with a baseball as hard as the ball today. So you can imagine how dangerous that was and how much skill you needed to play this game. The pitchers could take sort of a running start. They were pitched out of a box, which is why we still say the pitcher was knocked out of the box. It was basically a chalked square, chalked rectangle on the ground, and there was no raised pitching mound, and they sometimes took a running start and heaved the ball. And it was played very ruthlessly. They didn't permit substitutes during games. So the guys who suited up, the 9 players who suited up, had to stick it out for the whole game.
Whether they were injured or not.
Right. Well, if they were too severely injured, you could get somebody else in their place. But once somebody was in, the other one was out for the game, and you had to convince the umpire that this was the case. So it was a really a raucous, tough game, and I wrote these baseball books not just as baseball, but to write about the culture of America at the time, which was very difficult. I mean, we don't give our ancestors credit for what they went through. People were injured on farms and in factories. They had very short lifespans. They worked themselves to death, and these ball players had some of that quality. I mean, they were delighted to be playing out in the open in the fresh air, as opposed to what many of their fellow Americans were doing, and they fought really ruthlessly to keep these jobs. And they played injured, and they sustained a lot of damage playing this game.
So these were professional players. Would they have been paid?
Oh yes, they were professionals, major league players. They probably made $2,000 to $3,000 a year. Maybe some of the worst players a little less than that. That compares to about $500 that a laborer would make per year. So they were sort of not wildly out of the range of average Americans in those days. And then often they had to work during the winter, which damaged them further in some cases. So yeah, it was a professional game played by highly skilled players. They were essentially all white, although I devote a chapter in this book to the first recognized major league black player in 1884, who was Moses Fleetwood Walker. And the stuff he went through was just brutal in Jim Crow America, you could imagine.
So take us back then to 1883 and your story. It has an unlikely protagonist.
Well, I wanted to get into this just this crazy wild league, and especially the leading figure in the book is this guy named Chris von der Ey, who was a German immigrant. Some people pronounce it von der Ache, but I just go with von der Ey. and he was a German immigrant. He ran a grocery, which essentially dispensed liquor to people coming in off the street. And he realized there was this interesting game going on down the street from his grocery, and he started to pay some attention to it. And he realized this is a good way to sell beer, to bring beer out to the ballpark, and he would make some money selling beer. So he took his life savings. This is when in St. Louis, nobody could make a go of baseball in St. Louis, believe it or not, until this guy. And he took his life savings and he sort of saved the ballpark that was rotting away, and he sold beer at the games, and he did everything I mentioned, have Sunday games in the National League on the mostly on the Eastern Seaboard. These were very Protestant staid traditional communities, and they wouldn't permit baseball on Sundays. Sunday was a day of rest, and the blue laws were very strictly enforced. The immigrants that settled, especially German immigrants in the Midwest, had a very different attitude about Sunday. That was a family day. You'd go out and go to picnics and enjoy yourself, and go to ball games, go to saloons and everything. And that was the German experience. You would enjoy Sunday. So it's interesting how these immigrants shaped America's culture and really changed America's culture. Brought in beer. Beer wasn't a popular drink in America at all until the German immigrants came in and created these wonderful beers. Some of the just saw the other day one of the recipes for a St. Louis beer that was brought in by an immigrant, eventually became Sam Adams in Boston. And
Aha.
that was from a St. Louis German immigrant.
How about that?
So it's very interesting. And the book's about, it's not just about baseball, but it's about immigrants. It's about lager beer and how that changed America, about the different values of the older English immigrants and the more modern European, German and Irish immigrants.
So
And
as an
this,
yeah, I was going to ask you that question because I'm reading the book myself and thinking, okay, it's amazing some of the challenges that he had to overcome to get baseball going in St. Louis and then to establish this rival league. What were some of those challenges for our listeners?
well, I mean, baseball had gotten a really rank odor because the National League had a gambling scandal. A pennant was thrown in 1877 by the Louisville Club, and Boston won that pennant. So it was similar to the Black Sox scandal of 1919, the famous scandal that really threatened the existence of baseball, because if people can't trust the games to be played on the level, they won't go out to the games. And baseball had just gotten this bad odor to it, and this guy had to fight to bring back people to the games. And it's quite amazing how they did it. They started to get these huge crowds, and it's because they working people in America in those days worked 6 days a week. They worked through Saturday, and Sunday was their only day off. So this guy was having baseball games on Sunday, and that permitted people who worked relentlessly to get out to the ballpark and enjoy the game. So there was all this stuff. He knew nothing about baseball, which is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, that's what I found remarkable. This wasn't a guy who had played for a few years and then decided to take his hand at ownership.
Right, and he kept overruling his managers, which is a very, very dangerous thing for him to do, because he didn't really have a clue. He would scream at the players after a game, "Why did you drop that ball?" As if they could explain, why they couldn't catch a ball in a certain situation. and he's constantly threatening them and everything. So it's a funny story. This guy's a very, I mean, he's sort of like the original Yogi Berra. He had all these sayings that were, I wish I'd listened to mine own advice. And he talked about killing one bird with a double stone and all that stuff. So he would mangle the language, but he would have these pretty good ideas, and he hired some very smart people to run his team for him. So I get into this incredible pennant race in 1883, where all, 5 teams, I think, were in it to quite a ways through the season, and it's just, I just try to express what a wild situation this was. For instance, there's the Philadelphia Athletics, who are still exist as the Oakland A's, but they brought in this college pitcher who was called Jumping Jack Jones, and he literally jumped when he threw a pitch, and this staggered all the hitters, and he had a huge influence on that pennant race. He brought him in right at the end of the season. So I get into all the the really funny and quirky elements of baseball. It's totally forgotten today, except for, you got to go back to the original sources, the newspaper accounts of the games and memoirs and all that stuff, and dig it all out, and you find these wonderfully colorful characters and these great players and these great stories, and
Yeah,
injuries.
I have to tell you, when in reading your book, what I appreciated so much, and maybe not surprising from a newspaper man like yourself, but your attention to the newspaper coverage of the games and of the goings on. Were there people, were there sports writers that had the baseball beat? Did that exist? I mean, newspapers were obviously incredibly important in American life in the late 19th century. Just tell us a little bit about the relationship between baseball and newspapers.
Oh, it was a marriage made in heaven. I mean, these papers discovered by the 1880s that they could sell a lot of copies with doing game coverage. And they would cover like every play of the game and describe it and go through it, so you can get a real feel for what these games were like. And there were beat reporters, recognized beat reporters. They didn't usually sign their stuff with their names. So, but they were known around the league, and they got into these really pissy fights with other sports writers, and that was part of the humor of it. So I have some of that in the book, of them
Well, at least there's none of that in contemporary media.
No, but they're insulting each other and carrying on, and that was a really fun thing to discover in the 1880s. And they had their own language. Like, I had to learn the language of baseball in the 1880s. It's a different, there's all sorts of.
Yeah, for our listeners, what are some of those terms that you encountered?
Well, they talk about fans as cranks. They were known as cranks in those days, and oh boy, I'm drawing a blank here, but there's all sorts of terminology for different plays that are not what we would use today. So I had to learn this language and then sort of translate it for the reader.
Before we continue with our conversation, I'd like to have one of our faculty members tell you about a special documents-based graduate program for teachers of American history, government, and civics.
Hi, this is John Moser, Chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program at Ashland University. If you are an educator who teaches U.S. history, government, or politics, our program may be just what you've been looking for. Our approach is to emphasize primary sources, since we think the best way to study the past is to read the words of those who lived it. We have a distinguished faculty made up of professors from both Ashland University and from colleges and universities across the country. And they're not there to lecture to you. We think it's better to learn through conversation about the documents. Ours is a hybrid program with 2 different types of seminar. The first are our week-long intensive in-person courses during the summers on the beautiful campus of Ashland University. The second are our live synchronous online seminars offered throughout the year. So if you're a social studies teacher and you're looking to deepen your understanding of America's past and its politics, please check out the Master of Arts in American History and Government program. You can do that by visiting tah.org/programs.
But, I think it's just so wonderful how baseball in any era you look at it, it says so much about American culture at that time. It's almost uncanny.
Yeah.
And that's
In
what
fact, I was going to ask you that question because you
Yeah.
were saying this is not just a baseball history, but
Yeah.
for our listeners, this is a social history, it's a cultural history, and to some degree a political history as well of 1883 in
Right.
America.
Well,
I was just going to say, when you look at baseball in 1883, in your mind, how is it shaped by American culture? How does it reflect American culture? And maybe to some degree, how does it itself shape American culture?
Right. Well, the American Association is this, which was known as the Beer and Whiskey League, hence the title of the book. But they were clearly reflected the change, as I discussed, the change in American culture as immigrants came in and Sunday became an acceptable day to enjoy. That's one way it reflects American culture. The grim dedication of the players and their willingness to take risks and cheat to win reflects the American culture of the time. It was a very gung-ho culture where people, to get ahead, had to really work and really bend the rules. And that reflects it. It reflects the racial tensions in America at the time and how it just was considered outrageous for this league to bring in a black player. And that was very quickly clamped down on. And I think that's a remarkable story of this guy. This black player he's very similar to Jackie Robinson in some ways. He went to college. He was very sort of he kept very strong self-control. He was able to deal with these taunts and not react in a very extreme way. And so he was able to get through, but he had a very bitter experience doing this. And he eventually came to the conclusion that blacks should leave America. We shouldn't stay here and persist. So, but here's baseball opening up these ideas, giving you a glimpse into all these ideas and the culture going on. So that's really and at the bottom of it is just the aggression and the spirit. You have to really struggle to get ahead, and that was pure America in the 1880s. So that's what I tried to capture in the book.
Yeah. And as you say, the other thing that struck me was, as you mentioned before, the growth and importance of the railroads in facilitating things like a National League and an American League, that this movement of clubs back and forth could actually happen, and it didn't have to just take place within a city.
Right. And it couldn't get all the way out to the West Coast yet. That was that had to wait for sort of airplanes, but they got out to the Midwest, to St. Louis and Chicago, and they could bring that whole area into America, into the baseball world.
So this era of baseball, 1883, this wild pennant race, what effect did the fact that you had 5 teams contending for the pennant, and the hurly-burly and back and forth, and the newspaper coverage, which was, as you demonstrate in the book, really on top of this and sort of living and breathing this, what effect did the 1883 season have on the trajectory of baseball?
Well, I think it made baseball much more popular, and you could see that both in the National League, which had much lower attendance figures than the American Association, but it just generated a tremendous amount of interest in baseball. And by the end of the season, I write about a parade in a city that was the biggest parade since the end of the Civil War. And all of a sudden, this game that was considered, sort of a minor aspect of life became this, very popular with people, and they related to it and were proud of their local teams, and it just started to steamroll. And I think that's why this season's a tremendously interesting one.
Yeah, as you say, the subtitle, as it says, it made baseball America's game, really, right? And as you say, established
that
if you live in St. Louis or Chicago, now you have to be attached to your major league team.
Yeah, and baseball had been, popular before that, but this all of a sudden, thousands turned into tens of thousands. And
Yeah,
it was,
you mentioned attendance. What
Yeah.
our listeners will be very interested to know, what would be a typical attendance at a game?
Well, these were, very sparsely attended, probably 1,000 to 2,000. But for some of these Sunday games, there were 15,000 to 20,000, and they would just jam in the fans anywhere they could. Sometimes in the outfield, they just put them behind a rope. They would be happy to sell tickets as long as they could, and put them anywhere. So I write about some of that. How the ball was, the fielders had to contend with the fans in the outfield and all
Right.
that stuff. And actually, Bonderay put a beer garden in right field in St. Louis, and they had to deal with that as well. So, and he actually had some great ideas. These were all day games because they didn't really have lights. Although I write about an experiment with lights, having lights at a night game, even in 1883. But for the most part, they didn't have lights at these ballparks. But Bonderay would have fireworks at the ballpark at night, just to promote his team. And obviously that's still going strong. I just went to a minor league game a couple of weeks ago with a fireworks show at the end of it. It's still drawing fans.
So those players, would we recognize any of them today? I mean, for example, I think of I'm a Detroit Tigers fan, born and raised in Michigan. Ty Cobb, I think of course, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, Ty Cobb is a little bit later.
He's later.
Would we know? Would modern listeners today know or remember any of these players that you
probably wouldn't know these players? The most famous ones were sort of King Kelly in the National League and Cap Anson. A lot of this is the National League put the National League, the head of the National League was Al Spalding, the Spalding ball. I don't know if people know about that.
Oh,
but
yeah, of course.
He sort of led the way eventually for the creation of the Hall of Fame, and they persistently put National League players in the Hall of Fame, but not American Association players. So a lot of these players are forgotten. But this Charlie Comiskey played for the St. Louis Browns in 1883, and he became famous as the owner of the Chicago White Sox years later, and Comiskey Field and all that is named for him. So people might have heard of him. But mostly these people are forgotten, and it's wonderful to bring them back. I mean, there's a guy playing ball, Tony Mullane, who's throwing with both hands and that kind of stuff. There's great early players like Harry Stovey, who stole an incredible number of bases and was just a superb player, but he's totally forgotten by history. And I always thought Wanderé should be in the Hall of Fame, and there's been various efforts to put him there, but he hasn't made it yet. That old prejudice against the American Association continues, and he's such a clownish figure in some ways that hurts him. But I think he did a wonderful job bringing bringing baseball to life, and he should be recognized. I
What's
don't know what
one of
other famous players I can mention. Oh, Pete Browning was a great player, but who knows Pete Browning now?
right.
He often drank heavily and had trouble. Sometimes he would show up on the field drunk, and that was a problem. It's another aspect. You mentioned, how does this reflect American culture? Well, everybody drank. Americans drank huge amounts of liquor in those days, and ball players were no different. They often got into barroom brawls. They were drinking. They had hangovers, and the clubs would try to crack down on them, and with varying success. And you have all these very interesting personalities. Everything hadn't been ironed out. Everything wasn't based on statistical probability in those days. It was based on, you get out there on the field and play the game.
So, and all of these amazing characters, do you have a favorite, maybe besides Chris Von Der? Do you have a favorite player or a favorite interesting story or moment that you uncovered?
Well, a moment I really love is I mentioned they had to have 9 players suited up for the start of the game, and one of the players hadn't made it to the ballpark yet when they were supposed to go out on the field. So I write about one player faking these stomach cramps and groaning and screaming and carrying on until the other player arrived and they could all go out on the field. And there was a first baseman for the Cincinnati team, Long John Riley, who was actually a commercial artist, and he drew cartoons of that incident and other ones, and they're in the book. These wonderful cartoons and he drew one of Jumping Jack Jones, and so you get a real flavor for the color of those times.
What in writing this book, I think a lot of our listeners, they may know you from the Lincoln Miracle. And obviously there's some connection here with the 19th century, but how'd you uncover this really interesting character and this really interesting story?
I just loved early baseball, mainly for this reason that it's so little known. And you really have to work like a slave to go back and dig out these stories. You have to read every newspaper. I was a journalist in Washington, and I would go every night. I would go to the Library of Congress and look through their newspaper files. They had virtually every newspaper from around America, and that formed the basis of my research for my 2 baseball books, this one in 59 and 84 about old Hoss Radbourn, who won 59 or 60 games in a single season as a pitcher, which is incredible. But anyways, I was fascinated with the early game because these people are so forgotten and they deserve to be remembered. And I wanted to tell their stories. And I use a technique it's sort of called micro history. I mean, I looked at a single season in both of my baseball books, and I tend to look at short period. In my 2 Lincoln books, I looked at just one day in Lincoln's life, 24 hours in every drop of blood. And then in my new book, The Lincoln Miracle, I look at 1 week. And when you get down to the ground like that, all of a sudden these people come to life. They seem like human beings, and you can describe what's going on, the scene, the color, the way it smells, the way it sounds. And I tried to do that in all these books. And I suppose that's what they all have in common. I try to really put you there and give you a feel for what it actually felt like at the time.
Yeah, I have to tell our listeners that the characters are incredibly vivid, wonderfully drawn. You have succeeded in sort of bringing them back to life in all of their complexity and all of their reality.
Yes.
I think I would be remiss without in letting you go without asking you. You've studied early baseball. You've written about this amazing 1883 season. You're obviously a baseball fan. Compare 1883 baseball to today's baseball.
Well, it's 1883 baseball was very quick. It was action packed. It's so contrary to what our view of baseball is now. They didn't have long commercial breaks between innings, so one team went out on the field and then the other team went out on the field, and they didn't have a big long break between innings. So the games went very quickly. They were about an hour and a half or 2 hours.
Yeah, they're twice that now at least. Yeah.
Right. And baseball was competing with cricket for a while to be America's most popular game in the 1800s, and baseball won out because it was considered this fast-paced, lively, action-packed game. And it was. They played. They didn't waste a lot of time. They didn't go through all this nonsense that modern players do. They just got out there and played. And if they got out of line, the other pitcher would knock them down. And there was no penalty for that at the time. You could hit a batsman and he couldn't take first base.
Oh, really?
Today. So these guys stayed in line, and the pitchers had to hit when they got up, so it kept them fairly honest. So it was a different game. The most of the games took place in the afternoon, so sort of the upper middle class could leave their offices and go out to the ballpark, and they had to play them fast to get in before dusk descended. There was one umpire instead of 4, and that because the owners were so cheap. I mean, they didn't have a lot of money, so they just hired one umpire, and of course that permitted a great deal of cheating to go on.
Right.
So there's a famous guy, King Kelly in the National League, who used to, when the umpire was looking at the ball going out to right field, he would cut. He was on second base. He just missed third base by 10 feet and run home. And the crowd would see it, but the umpire would be distracted and couldn't see it. So that permitted, all sorts of antics that I write about in these books. The other thing was they tried to use one baseball a game. Now, I knew a minor league owner who told me they averaged 104 baseballs a game.
Yeah, how do you possibly have one baseball?
They had one, so when it was fouled in the crowd, they had to throw it back onto the field. And by the end of the game, it was mushy, and it was falling apart, and it was in really bad shape. So that helped the pitchers quite a bit because it was harder to drive the ball. So this is the game that was played back then. It's very interesting to me how they did this and adapted their strategy to it.
It's fascinating. It is a terrific story. Let me commend it to our listeners. Again, it's Ed Achorn's book, The Summer of Beer and Whiskey. If you
have a copy of it?
There it is.
That's what it looks like.
I do have a copy. There it is. And it is a wonderful book. If you love baseball, if you love American history, social history, cultural history, you are going to love this book. And as I said, the story is just a ripping good page turner. Ed, thanks so much for taking the time again to join us on The American Idea.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It was great to be here.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The American Idea. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe at Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review. If you want to learn more or get involved in Ashbrook's vital work, visit our website, ashbrook.org.